In the sweltering heat of July 1187, beneath the twin peaks known as the Horns of Hattin, the fate of Christendom in the East was about to be decided by a single, catastrophic day. What unfolded on that scorching battlefield would not merely determine the outcome of one battle, but would shatter the very foundations of the Crusader states and herald the rise of a legend whose name would echo through history. This is the story of Saladin's masterstroke, a tactical brilliance so devastating that it would reclaim Jerusalem and transform the balance of power in the Holy Land forever. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the Palestinian landscape as two armies faced each other in what would become one of the most decisive confrontations in medieval history. On one side stood the combined might of the Crusader states, 20,000 strong, their armor gleaming under banners that bore the cross of Christ. On the other, the forces of Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the Kurdish warrior who had united the Muslim world under his banner, commanding an army that stretched across the horizon like a dark tide. But to understand how this moment came to pass, we must journey back to the origins of the man who would become known to history as Saladin. Born in the Iraqi city of Tikrit in 1137, Yusuf ibn Ayyub emerged from a Kurdish military family whose fortunes were tied to the complex web of medieval Middle Eastern politics. His father Ayyub and uncle Shirkuh served as elite commanders under the powerful Zengid dynasty, rulers who controlled northern Syria and posed a constant threat to the Crusader principalities. The young Saladin's education in warfare began not in the classrooms of scholars, but in the harsh realities of campaign and siege. When his uncle Shirkuh was dispatched to Egypt in 1164 on behalf of the Zengid ruler Nur ad-Din, Saladin accompanied him, witnessing firsthand the crumbling state of the Fatimid Caliphate that had once been a jewel of the Islamic world. Egypt, with its ancient wealth and strategic position, had become a prize coveted by multiple powers, and it was here that Saladin would first demonstrate the political acumen that would define his career. The death of Shirkuh in 1169 presented the young Kurdish officer with an unexpected opportunity. Rather than being sidelined by more senior commanders, Saladin was chosen to succeed his uncle, a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential appointments in medieval history. As vizier of the dying Fatimid state, he moved with calculated precision, gradually consolidating power while nominally serving his distant master Nur ad-Din in Damascus. When the last Fatimid caliph died in 1171, Saladin struck with the timing of a master chess player. He abolished the Shia Fatimid Caliphate and restored Egypt to Sunni orthodoxy, effectively making himself the independent ruler of the Nile Kingdom. This was no mere religious gesture, but a calculated political move that would allow him to claim legitimacy as a champion of Orthodox Islam while building the economic and military foundation for his future conquests. The death of Nur ad-Din in 1174 provided Saladin with the opening he had been waiting for. Rather than remaining content as ruler of Egypt alone, he launched a brilliant campaign to unite the fractured Muslim territories of Syria and northern Mesopotamia under his banner. City after city fell to his combination of diplomatic skill and military pressure. Damascus, the pearl of Syria, opened its gates to him. Aleppo, after initial resistance, eventually submitted. Mosul, the key to controlling northern Mesopotamia, fell under his sway. By 1186, Saladin had achieved what no Muslim ruler had accomplished since the arrival of the Crusaders nearly a century earlier. He had forged a unified Islamic state that stretched from the banks of the Nile to the upper reaches of the Euphrates, encircling the Crusader states like the closing jaws of a vice. The Christians suddenly found themselves facing not the divided Muslim principalities they had grown accustomed to exploiting, but a single, determined adversary with resources that dwarfed their own. The spark that would ignite this powder keg came from an unlikely source, a Crusader lord whose reckless ambition would doom his fellow Christians. Raynald of Châtillon, master of the fortress of Kerak, had built his reputation on audacious raids against Muslim territories. His castle controlled the vital trade routes between Syria and Egypt, and he had grown wealthy by extracting tribute from passing caravans. But Raynald's appetite for plunder knew no bounds, and his actions would soon provide Saladin with the perfect justification for war. In late 1186, While a truce supposedly protected both Christian and Muslim territories, Raynald launched a devastating attack on a massive Muslim pilgrimage caravan making its way to Mecca. The caravan was not merely a collection of merchants and pilgrims, it was under Saladin's personal protection, and its destruction was both an act of banditry and a direct insult to the Sultan's honor. When word reached Saladin of this brazen violation of the truce, his response was swift and unequivocal. The time for diplomacy had ended. The Crusader leadership found itself fractured at the very moment when unity was most crucial. King Guy de Lusignan, who had claimed the throne of Jerusalem through marriage rather than blood, lacked the natural authority needed to command respect from the fractious nobles of the kingdom. His rival, Raymond III of Tripoli, commanded significant military resources but harbored deep resentment against Guy's rule. The tensions between these two factions would prove catastrophic when swift, decisive action was needed most. As spring gave way to summer in 1187, Saladin assembled the largest army of his career on the Golan Heights. Contemporary sources speak of 40,000 men answering his call to jihad, including 12,000 elite cavalry, whose reputation struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. This was not merely an army, it was the embodiment of a unified Islamic world's determination to reclaim the Holy Land from the Christian invaders. The Sultan's strategy was as elegant as it was deadly. Rather than assault the heavily fortified Christian strongholds directly, he would draw their army into the open where his superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the terrain would give him every advantage. The target he chose was Tiberias, a city of significant strategic importance but relatively light defenses. The attack on Tiberias was never intended to be a conquest in itself. It was bait in a trap that would ensnare the entire military might of the Crusader states. When news of the assault reached the Christian army assembled at Saffuriya, the reaction was exactly what Saladin had anticipated. Despite the protests of more cautious commanders who recognized the trap being set, King Guy ordered his forces to march to the relief of Tiberias. It was a decision that would be remembered as one of the greatest military blunders in history, yet at the time it seemed unavoidable. To abandon Tiberias without a fight would be to invite accusations of cowardice and incompetence that Guy's already shaky reign could not survive. The Christian army that set out from Saffuriya on the 2nd of July, 1187, represented the full military might of the Crusader states. 20,000 men marched beneath the summer sun, their ranks including the flower of Christian knighthood, battle-hardened infantry, and mounted sergeants whose families had served in the Holy Land for generations. At the head of the column rode the true cross, the most sacred relic in Christendom, carried by the Bishop of Acre as a symbol of divine favor. But as the great host moved eastward through the Palestinian countryside, they were already walking into the jaws of destruction. The march from Saffuriya would become a nightmare that haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. As the massive Christian column stretched across miles of dusty road, Saladin's light cavalry began their deadly dance of harassment. Like wolves circling a wounded beast, Muslim horse archers struck at the flanks and rear of the Christian army, loosing volleys of arrows before melting away into the shimmering heat. The heavily armored knights, weighed down by chainmail and steel in the scorching July sun, could do nothing but endure the constant barrage. The terrain itself became an enemy. The rocky hills and narrow valleys channeled the Christian forces along predictable routes, while Saladin's men, born to this harsh landscape, moved with the fluid grace of desert nomads. Every ridge concealed archers, every wadi hid cavalry ready to strike. The Crusaders found themselves fighting not just an army, but the very land itself, as if Palestine itself had risen to expel the foreign invaders. By evening of the 2nd of July, the Christian army had covered barely half the distance to Tiberias. Exhaustion weighed on every man like a physical burden. Horses stumbled and fell, their riders forced to continue on foot. The wounded cried out for water that was nowhere to be found, while the constant harassment from Muslim skirmishers prevented any meaningful rest. King Guy faced an agonizing choice: press on through the night toward Tiberias and risk his army's complete collapse, or make camp and give Saladin more time to position his forces for the final blow. The decision to halt near the village of Hattin would be debated by historians for centuries to come. The twin hills that gave the place its name rose from the landscape like ancient sentinels, their slopes covered in dry grass that rustled ominously in the desert wind. It was here, trapped between the rocky outcroppings and cut off from any source of fresh water, that the flower of Christian knighthood would spend their final night. Saladin had achieved something that military theorists would study for generations. Without fighting a single major engagement, he had maneuvered his enemies into a position of hopeless disadvantage. The Christian army was exhausted, demoralized, and desperately thirsty. Their horses were dying beneath them, and their supply lines had been cut by roving bands of Muslim cavalry. Most critically, they were now completely surrounded, with no hope of retreat or reinforcement. As darkness fell over the Horns of Hattin, the Sultan's forces tightened their grip like a noose. Campfires dotted the surrounding hills in every direction, a constellation of enemy positions that stretched to the horizon. The Muslims had brought ample supplies of food and water, their pack animals laden with provisions for what they knew would be the decisive battle of the campaign. In stark contrast, the Christians huddled around their meager fires, rationing the last drops of water from their nearly empty skins. The psychological warfare began before the first arrow flew at dawn. Throughout the night, Muslim drums thundered from the darkness, their rhythm designed to prevent the Christians from finding rest. War cries echoed across the hills in Arabic, Kurdish, and Turkish, a babel of voices united in their determination to drive the Crusaders into the sea. Some Christian knights tried to sleep in their armor, too exhausted to remove the heavy mail that had protected them during the day's march. Others sat awake, staring into the darkness and wondering if they would live to see another sunset. The most devastating psychological blow came with the sunrise. As the first light crept across the battlefield, Saladin's men set fire to the dry grass and scrubland surrounding the Christian position. The flames spread quickly, driven by the morning breeze, creating a wall of smoke and fire that choked the already parched Crusaders. The symbolism was unmistakable. The very earth was rejecting the Christian presence, consuming itself rather than provide comfort to the invaders. King Guy's attempts to maintain order became increasingly desperate as the morning progressed. Knights who had never shown fear in battle began to speak openly of death, their voices hoarse from thirst and smoke inhalation. The infantry, pressed together in tight formations for protection, could barely lift their weapons. Even the true cross, carried proudly at the army's head just days before, now seemed like a mockery of divine favor as smoke swirled around the sacred relic. When Saladin finally gave the order to attack, it came not as a single overwhelming assault, but as a coordinated symphony of destruction. His archers, positioned on the higher ground around the Christian position, began a methodical slaughter that would continue for hours. Arrow after arrow fell among the packed Crusader ranks, finding gaps in armor weakened by days of marching and fighting. The Christians' shields, designed to protect against sword blows and lance thrusts, proved inadequate against the storm of missiles that darkened the sky. The Crusader cavalry, the elite striking force that had dominated Middle Eastern battlefields for nearly a century, found themselves helpless against an enemy that refused to meet them in direct combat. Every charge ended in frustration as Muslim horsemen simply withdrew before the thundering knights, only to return once the heavy cavalry had exhausted themselves. The Christians were like bulls being tormented by matadors, their strength turned against them by an enemy who understood exactly how to exploit their weaknesses. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became unbearable, the true genius of Saladin's strategy became apparent. He was not merely fighting a battle, he was orchestrating the complete psychological collapse of his enemies. Every element of the engagement had been calculated to maximize Christian suffering while minimizing Muslim casualties. The fire, the smoke, the thirst, the arrows raining from above, all combined to create a hell on earth that broke the spirit of men who had considered themselves the finest warriors in Christendom. The sight of Christian knights, legends in their own time, reduced to stumbling figures barely able to lift their weapons, must have seemed like divine justice to the Muslim warriors watching from the hills. These were the same men who had carved out kingdoms in the heart of the Islamic world, who had slaughtered thousands at Jerusalem nearly a century before. Now they gasped for water like dying fish, their magnificent war horses collapsing beneath them as arrows found their mark. By midday, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The question was not whether the Christians would be defeated, but how many would survive the catastrophe their leaders had brought upon them. The greatest army the Crusader states had ever assembled was dissolving before Saladin's eyes, not through any single crushing blow, but through the methodical application of tactical brilliance and an understanding of desert warfare that the European invaders had never truly grasped. The moment of final reckoning arrived not on trumpets or banners, but with the desperate gasps of dying men and the clash of steel against hopelessness. King Guy, his royal surcoat stained with dust and sweat, looked out over what remained of his once mighty host and saw not an army, but a collection of broken souls clinging to life by threads. The morning's confident ranks had devolved into clusters of desperate men, their formations shattered by hours of relentless assault from an enemy who seemed to materialize from the very air itself. Saladin, watching from his position on the heights, recognized the moment when resistance transforms into mere survival. The Christian knights, those legendary warriors whose reputation had once struck terror across the Islamic world, now fought not for glory or conquest, but simply for one more breath, one more heartbeat. Their horses lay scattered across the rocky ground, great destriers that had carried their masters from distant European shores, now reduced to arrow-studded carcasses, baking in the Palestinian the Sunday. The tactical brilliance of Sultan's strategy revealed itself in layers, like an intricate manuscript whose meaning becomes clear only when studied in its entirety. Every the battlefield element had been transformed into a weapon. The rocky terrain that prevented organized cavalry charges, the absence of water sources that turned thirst into a more deadly enemy than any sword, the positioning of his forces to create killing fields from which there was no escape. This was warfare elevated to the level of art, a masterpiece painted in blood and desperation. As the afternoon wore on, the Christians made one final desperate attempt to break free from their torment. The surviving knights, perhaps 300 men who could still mount their remaining horses, gathered around the true cross for what they knew would be their last charge. The relic that had led them to victory in countless battles across the Holy Land now served as a rallying point for what amounted to a glorious suicide. Their lances, many broken or lost, had been replaced with swords and maces. Their shields, pierced by arrows and scarred by combat, hung heavy on arms that could barely lift them. The charge itself was a thing of terrible beauty, a final defiant gesture from men who had chosen death over surrender. They thundered down the slope with the fury of the damned, their war cries echoing off the hills as they sought one last moment of glory before the darkness claimed them. For a brief instant, it seemed as though the old magic might still hold, that the shock of heavy cavalry might yet shatter Saladin's carefully laid plans. But the Muslim forces had prepared for this moment as surely as they had prepared for everything else. Like water flowing around a stone, they parted before the Christian charge, allowing the knights to exhaust themselves against empty air before closing in from all sides. The very momentum that had made the cavalry charge so devastating on other battlefields now became a trap, carrying the knights deep into enemy lines where they were cut off and surrounded. One by one, the great names of Christian knighthood fell. Men whose ancestors had conquered kingdoms and whose deeds filled the songs of troubadours found themselves pulled from their saddles and overwhelmed by numbers beyond counting. The true cross, that most sacred of relics, passed from dying hands into the possession of Saladin's warriors, a symbol of how completely the tide had turned. King Guy himself, the man whose decisions had led to this catastrophe, found his horse killed beneath him and was forced to fight on foot among his household knights. Surrounded by the bodies of his greatest nobles, he made his final stand not as a king commanding armies, but as a simple dignity remain knight facing death with whatever to him. When the Muslim warriors finally overwhelmed his last defenders, they found a man aged decades in the space of hours, his eyes hollow with the knowledge of what his reign had cost. The capture of the king marked the effective end of organized resistance, though pockets of Christians continued to fight with the desperate fury of cornered beasts. Saladin's men moved methodically through the battlefield, separating the living from the dead, the valuable prisoners from those destined for immediate execution. The ground itself seemed to weep, soaked with the blood of thousands who had marched from Saffuriya with such high hopes just days before. Among the most significant prisoners taken that day was Raynald of Châtillon, the man whose greed had provided the spark for this conflagration. Bound and brought before Saladin, he showed no remorse for the actions that had doomed his fellow Christians. The Sultan, his face a mask of controlled fury, offered the captured lord a drink of water, a gesture of hospitality that carried deadly implications in the desert code of honor. When Raynald accepted the cup, Saladin informed him that no man could claim mercy who had not given it. The blade that took Raynald's life was wielded by the Sultan himself, a personal settling of accounts that sent a clear message to any who might consider breaking faith with him in the future. The fate of the captured Templars and Hospitallers was even more severe. These military monks, sworn to eternal war against Islam, were deemed too dangerous to be allowed to live. Saladin ordered their mass execution, viewing them not as mere soldiers but as the embodiment of the crusading spirit that had brought such suffering to his people. Only their grand masters were spared, kept alive as valuable bargaining pieces for future negotiations. The psychological impact of these executions rippled through both armies. For the Christians, it demonstrated the futility of resistance and the complete reversal of their fortunes. For the Muslims, it was proof that their long struggle against the Crusader states had entered a new phase, one in which victory was not merely possible but inevitable. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the magnitude of the disaster became clear to all who witnessed it. Of the 20,000 men who had marched from Saffuriya, barely 3,000 would see their homes again as free men. The rest lay dead on the field, or bound as prisoners, their dreams of defending Christendom transformed into a nightmare from which there would be no awakening. The capture of the True Cross dealt a blow to Christian morale that extended far beyond the battlefield itself. This was not merely a piece of wood, but the favor symbol of divine that had led the Crusaders to their greatest victories. Its loss suggested that God himself had withdrawn his protection from the Christian cause, leaving them vulnerable to the righteous wrath of their enemies. Saladin's treatment of his victory revealed the character that would make him a legend in both Christian and Muslim sources. Rather than indulging in the massacre that had marked the Crusader conquest of Jerusalem nearly a century before, he showed restraint and mercy to those who had not personally wronged him. Common soldiers were ransomed or released, their lives spared in recognition of their status as mere followers rather than leaders of the crusading enterprise. This calculated mercy served multiple purposes beyond simple humanitarianism. It demonstrated to the watching world that Islamic rule could be both just and magnasting sharply with the brutality that animus contra had characterized Christian conquest. More practically, it encouraged other Crusader strongholds to surrender rather than face siege, knowing that reasonable terms might be offered to those who yielded without resistance. The news of Hattin's outcome spread across the known world with the speed of wildfire. In the Crusader territories, panic gripped both noble and commoner as the reality of their situation became clear. With their main army destroyed and their king captured, the remaining strongholds were left virtually defenseless, their garrisons depleted and their morale shattered. Saladin wasted no time in exploiting his advantage. Within days of the battle, his forces were on the march throughout the Holy Land, appearing before fortress after fortress with demands for surrender. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking to witness, as citadels that had stood for decades against Muslim assault simply opened their gates rather than face hopeless siege. Acre, the economic heart of the Crusader states, surrendered within 5 days without a single blow being struck. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and dozens of lesser strongholds followed in rapid succession, their defenders recognizing that resistance was futile without hope of relief. The carefully constructed network of Christian power in the Levant unraveled like a tapestry whose threads had been cut, each loss making the next surrender more inevitable. The psychological warfare that had proven so effective at Hattin continued to serve Saladin well in the aftermath. Local populations, both Christian and Muslim, who had lived under Crusader rule for generations, began to see the writing on the wall. In many cases, it was not Saladin's armies that captured the cities, but internal revolts by residents who chose to welcome the Sultan's forces rather than face the consequences of continued resistance. The speed of this collapse created a momentum that seemed unstoppable. Each victory brought not only territorial gains but also recruited fresh troops to Saladin's banner, as local militias and formerly neutral powers recognized that the tide had turned decisively against the Christian cause. What had begun as a single battle was transforming into a general uprising against Crusader rule throughout the region. By late summer of 1187, only a handful of major strongholds remained in Christian hands, isolated islands in a sea of Islamic resurgence. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had once stretched from the Mediterranean coast deep into the Transjordan, was reduced to a few scattered fortresses whose garrisons waited in growing desperation for relief that would never come. The stage was now set for the final act of this drama, the assault on Jerusalem itself, the city that had given its name to the Crusader kingdom, and whose possession was the ultimate prize in this centuries-long struggle for control of the Holy Land. The gates of Jerusalem would fall to Saladin just 3 months later, completing a transformation that began on those scorching hills near Hattin. In a single day, the Kurdish warrior had accomplished what seemed impossible just weeks before, shattering the military might of the Crusader states and opening the path to reclaim the Holy City. The battle that had begun with 20,000 Christian warriors marching confidently toward Tiberias ended with the capture of kings, the loss of sacred relics, and the collapse of nearly a century of Crusader dominance in the East. Saladin's victory was more than tactical brilliance. It was a masterclass in understanding that wars are won not just with swords and arrows, but with the manipulation of terrain, weather, and human psychology itself. He had turned the desert into his ally and the sun into his weapon, proving that genius lies not in overwhelming force, but in making the enemy defeat themselves through their own desperation and poor judgment. The reverberations of Hattin would echo across continents, sparking the Third Crusade and drawing the greatest kings of Europe eastward in a desperate attempt to reclaim what had been lost in a single, catastrophic day. Yet the Holy Land would never again know the unchallenged Christian dominance that had marked the early crusading period. The Kurdish general who had risen from the ranks to unite the Islamic world had achieved something far greater than military victory. He had shifted the very course of history beneath the unforgiving sun of Palestine.